I saw her get out of that black limousine, looking like a goddess in silk and diamonds, while I stood there, in my worn-out apron, smelling of mold. Jenny, my younger sister, the one I was sure life had swallowed forever, was back. The shock of seeing her there, so opulent, in front of the nursing home where I was vegetating, was like a punch to the chest. The silence that followed, broken only by the sound of rain on the roof, was proof of the deepest humiliation I had ever felt. The scene was a brutal contrast. Her wealth, screaming, and my misery, silent. As I watched her, her expensive shoes sinking into the muddy garden, a mix of love, hurt, and a bitter mistrust settled in me. Where had she been all this time? Why, knowing about my life, my struggles, my grief, did she only reappear now? There was no hug, no tears of reunion, just a look of polished superiority and the way she held her purse, as if contact with that dirty place could stain her. That look made me feel small, as if my whole life of work and dignity was worth nothing. Then she opened her mouth and with a few words revealed everything, without a drop of remorse. "Here, Dawn," she said, handing me papers and a bank book, a coffee plantation, 4 million pounds. In that instant, I realized the fortune was not a gift. It was a payment, an attempt to buy back a past she couldn't erase. What did she really want with all this? What secret was hidden behind that gesture? A secret that could be the ruin of the peace I had, even in the midst of my poverty? If my story makes you think about what really matters in life, stay with me until the end. And if you want to keep hearing real stories like this, about human complexities and secrets that time doesn't erase, subscribe and share. Maybe the next story is yours. My name is Dawn Candace Sullivan. I'm 78 years old and I spend my days at the Lotus Flower Retirement Home on the outskirts of London. The place smells of mold and bleach, a smell that soaks into your clothes and skin, as if to remind you at every moment that here, time drips by slowly, heavily. The peeling walls reveal damp brick, and the stuck windows only let in crooked slivers of light. I've always been a woman of silence, but here, silence isn't a choice, it's an imposition. In the morning, I wake up to the metallic clatter of a tray hitting the door. Weak tea, stale bread, watery margarine. My dry mouth begs for one more sip, but everything is already accounted for. I save a small piece for later, when hunger returns between one nap and another. The only luxury I allow myself is running my fingers over the silver locket I hide under my pillow. Inside is the only photograph I've never shown anyone. Me and my sister, Jeannie, still girls in the Lake District, dressed alike. Sometimes I wonder if she still exists. It's been decades without a word. While I sewed dresses for daughters of important people, she disappeared, as if she had been swallowed by the world. I think about this when I try to mend my own clothes, already worn, with the same attention I once dedicated to lace embroideries. The stitches no longer come out firm, my hands shake, and even so, it's the only thing that distracts me from the weight of having no one to visit me. That afternoon, the rain beat down hard on the roof, spreading a smell of wet earth that mixed with the mold on the walls. I was leaning back in my armchair, dozing, when I heard a different sound, the deep rumble of a powerful engine. Through the window, I saw the glint of a black limousine parking in front of the rusty gate of the home. The nurses whispered. The other residents got up as if it were a show. And I, with my heart racing, saw a figure get out of the car. High heels, a fine wool coat, immaculate hair. It was her, my sister, the woman who abandoned me forever. Dawn. "You're unrecognizable," she said, wrinkling her nose, like someone who smells something bad. The phrase pierced me, like a broken needle. I didn't have a mirror, but I knew what I looked like. Dry skin, a faded dress, worn shoes. The contrast with the woman in front of me was humiliating. Her gaze held not only surprise, but something like pity, and that hurt more than all the silence of all these years. Jeannie entered the retirement home's hall as if she owned the place. The floorboards creaked under her heels, while the other residents watched her with the same reverence with which a group of ants looks at a flame. I, shrunken, held my locket hidden in my pocket, afraid she would see it. The strong perfume she exuded, a mixture of jasmine and something citrusy, covered the smell of reheated soup from the dining room. When everyone expected a scene of warm reunion, she simply opened a leather folder and took out some papers. Here are the deeds to a coffee plantation in Bristol and a bank account with £4 million, she said, handing them to me without even sitting down. I was breathless. It was as if my entire life of privation had been reduced to a signature on a document she carried like someone delivering a package. I couldn't ask anything at the time. My throat was tight, but inside my head, the questions hammered like a blacksmith's hammers. Why now? What made her disappear for so many years, while I withered here, forgotten? And even more, what did this poisoned gift mean? As she awaited my reaction with an enigmatic expression, I knew, deep down, that this visit was not a gesture of affection. It was the prelude to something much bigger and much more painful. The silence that followed that delivery was so heavy that even the sound of the rain seemed to diminish. I looked at the papers, the letters blurring before my tired eyes, and felt the cold texture of the locket hidden in my pocket, as if it were the only thing holding me to the ground. The other residents murmured among themselves, some smiling, perhaps imagining that my life had just changed for the better, but I couldn't feel joy. Jeannie's gesture didn't have the sweet smell of generosity, but rather the metallic taste of something that hid thorns. "Aren't you going to say anything?" she insisted, her voice dry, modulated like someone speaking in business meetings. I noticed the gleam of her pearl earrings and the impeccable cut of her coat, which seemed to repel even the dampness that clung to all of us. The nurses looked at her with a mixture of respect and fear, as if her mere presence was capable of elevating the decadent status of the retirement home. I took a deep breath before replying, "I don't know what to say. Jeannie, why now?" My voice came out hoarse, more a whisper than a question. She looked away, just for an instant, before regaining her composure. "Things have changed. I thought you deserved at least a piece of what I've achieved." Those words kept spinning in my mind like a needle stuck in a sewing machine, repeating the same stitch without moving. Deserved? After years of absolute silence, of not even replying to my old letters, now she appeared with this speech, as if it were just a matter of delayed justice? My stomach churned, and the smell of sour soup from the dining room seemed even worse. One of the residents, Mrs. Henderson, approached, curious, leaning on the worn banister of the stairs. "My goodness. Dawn, look at that gift. You're going to leave here rich," she said, with a nervous giggle that mixed envy and disbelief. Those words echoed through the hall and made me feel even smaller. It was as if everyone was now looking at me as someone who had just won the lottery, when in reality, I only felt fear. Jenny noticed the attention she was attracting and adjusted her hair, satisfied with the stares, as if she were on a stage. I tried to find some tenderness in her, a trace of the girl who used to share warm Cornish pasties with me in the Lake District, who laughed at the sound of the church bells echoing through the stone streets. But there was none of that in her eyes, only a calculated coldness, like someone measuring distances and assessing risks. "This plantation has always been in our family, Dawn. Now it's yours, and the money will ensure you never have to depend on anyone again." The words sounded beautiful, but they had the firmness of a sentence. It was as if she were reminding me that I had lived as a dependent, forgotten, and that only now she had decided to snatch me from that. Fate. I was trembling. I didn't know if it was from emotion, cold, or suppressed anger. I ran my hand over my arm, feeling my thin, goose-bumped skin, while the weight of the offer seeped into me like a shadow. If I accepted, it meant I recognized her as the savior she never was. If I refused, it seemed crazy. Who in their right mind would reject £4 million and a plantation? Still, what corroded me most was the lack of an answer to the essential question. Where had she been all this time? The nurse in charge of the shift, Sister Beatrice, approached to ease the atmosphere. "Maybe it's better for you to talk calmly somewhere else, ladies. It's raining a lot here and the noise is distracting." But her voice was unsure, as if she didn't know whether she should interrupt. Jeannie smiled faintly, that smile of someone who is always one step ahead. "Of course, sister. I'll take my sister out for dinner. We have a lot to talk about." She said this not as an invitation, but as an order that had already been decided. While she spoke, I noticed her eyes scanning the room, observing the lined-up beds, the clothes drying on makeshift lines, the poorly closed windows. I felt ashamed, as if that place only reflected my personal defeat, when, in fact, it was the fate of many like me. She, however, seemed to use that setting as a contrast to reinforce her position of power, and I, not knowing how to react, just nodded in silence, knowing that I had no choice. But inside me, something was brewing. It wasn't just gratitude or resentment. It was a bitter feeling that by extending her hand, she was actually opening a door that might be very expensive to walk through. The dinner took place at a restaurant in the center of London, one of those places with starched white tablecloths and waiters who moved with calculated silence. I couldn't remember the last time I had entered such an environment. The smell of grilled meat mixed with the scent of expensive wine made me dizzy, almost displaced in time. I felt my hands trembling on the linen napkin, so different from the stained cloth we used at the retirement home. Jenny, sitting across from me, seemed perfectly at ease, as if that setting were a natural extension of her life. She ordered the most expensive wine on the list without even looking at the prices. "You always liked coffee, Dawn. Who knows, maybe this plantation will give you back a little pride," she said, crossing her legs with rehearsed elegance. That phrase scratched me inside. Pride? I never needed a plantation or a fortune to be proud. My pride was in the dresses I created, in the brides who walked down the aisle using my hands as invisible weavers of dreams. But there, in front of her, my story seemed reduced to dust. "Ginny, why did you never come back? Why didn't you reply when I wrote, when Mum died, when I needed you?" I asked. My voice choked. The waiter, who was serving the wine, looked away like someone invading a forbidden intimacy. She put down her glass, leaned forward and said in a low, almost cutting tone, "Because I had bigger things to achieve, and you were always the type to be content with little." The blow was direct. The cruelty was not just in the phrase, but in the naturalness with which she said it. I remember feeling a heat rising to my face, as if I had been slapped. The voices around me became a distant blur. The clinking of cutlery seemed to echo inside my head. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the glass on the floor, but all I could do was fall silent, squeezing the locket in the pocket of my simple dress that made me look like an intruder in that hall. My sister, the same one who once shared the same blanket with me on a cold night in the Lake District, now looked at me as if she were evaluating merchandise. "Don't think of this as charity, Dawn. Think of it as compensation," she added, with a calmness that unnerved me. Compensation. That word hung in the air, loaded with unsaid secrets. Compensation for what? For the abandonment? For the lies? For the calculated distance? I smiled bitterly, unable to swallow that version of the story. And I noticed she looked away again, just for an instant, as if she feared I would press the question. The main course arrived, a steak in a mushroom sauce that exuded a rich aroma, contrasting with the watery beans I ate daily at the home. I put the first forkful in my mouth, but the taste seemed strange, too heavy, as if the food also carried the weight of the unsaid words. Jeannie ate calmly, cutting each piece as if nothing else mattered. That scene reminded me of when, as children, she would hide pieces of candy in her pocket, while I shared mine with her. The dinner progressed, and with each minute, the feeling that something was hidden only grew. "Dawn, tomorrow morning I'll take you to the plantation. You need to see it with your own eyes. It's your future now." The phrase sounded more like an order than an invitation. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to say I didn't need anything, that I preferred my little corner at the home to the weight of that inheritance. But something in the firmness of her tone made me just nod in silence, knowing I had no choice. As we walked back to the car, the rain had stopped, and the smell of wet earth still hung in the air. The cold night air clung to my skin, and the city seemed asleep, except for the yellow lights reflected in the puddles on the street. I sat in the back of the limousine, surrounded by luxury, but feeling more trapped than ever. Jenny was on the phone, speaking in a low voice, quick phrases in a commanding tone, and no longer seemed to notice my presence. It was at that moment that I understood. This reunion wasn't about me. It was about something bigger, and I was just at the center of a game I didn't yet understand. The next morning was cold and misty. Jeannie's car was waiting for me at the door of the retirement home, and the other residents watched from the window as if I were an improvised actress in a show no one expected. The smell of reheated coffee from the dining room still permeated the air when I got into the limousine, where an expensive perfume already dominated the space. With every mile we traveled towards the plantation, my anxiety grew, tightening my chest like a poorly made seam that pulls the thread until it tears the fabric. The road to Bristol seemed endless. The sky still carried heavy clouds from the previous day's rain, and the wet earth exuded an intense odor, mixed with the smell of the immaculately polished leather seats. I looked out the window and saw the coffee fields stretching as far as the eye could see, a deep green that reminded me of dresses I had embroidered decades ago for families who owned lands like those. Cruel irony. I, who spent my life sewing for the rich, now found myself a late heiress of something I didn't build. When we arrived, the main house of the plantation revealed itself as imposing, with its whitewashed walls, blue wooden windows, and a wide porch that seemed to breathe history. The sound of cicadas filled the air, mixed with the distant noise of workers who were already moving among the rows of coffee. Genia walked ahead, her high heels tapping firmly on the stone floor, and I, with slow steps, tried to absorb it all without getting lost in the feeling of strangeness. The sweet smell of freshly harvested coffee almost brought tears to my eyes, as if the place were trying to seduce me. "It's yours now, Dawn. All of this. Isn't it beautiful?" Genia said, opening her arms as if presenting a work of art. The scene seemed staged. I looked at the immensity of the coffee fields and felt a knot in my throat. The beauty was undeniable, but along with it came an overwhelming weight. What did it mean to receive such a responsibility after a lifetime of being forgotten? And why right now, after decades in which I was nothing, more than a ghost to her? An administrator appeared, a thin man with sun-beaten skin, a straw hat, and a thick mustache. "Mrs. Sullivan, welcome. It's an honor. We've already prepared everything for your arrival," he said, avoiding looking directly at Janai, but clearly accustomed to her presence. That made me uneasy. If the plantation had always been in the family's name, why was I only now being presented as the owner? I felt that the man knew more than he was saying, and the formality in his voice sounded almost rehearsed. As we walked through the interior of the house, I smelled the strong scent of waxed wood and the coldness of the old tiled floor under my tired feet. Paintings of English landscapes adorned the walls, and heavy, solid wood furniture imposed an almost suffocating seriousness. I ran my hand over the backs of the chairs, as if I wanted to absorb the stories that place held. Jenny, however, seemed impatient, as if she had no time for contemplation. "Don't get stuck in the past, Dawn. The future is what matters now," she said in a cutting tone. Those words sounded like a warning. The future she described didn't seem to be exactly mine, but hers. In every room, in every detail of that house, I felt less like the owner and more like an intruder. The smell of the plantation, the light filtered through the old windows, the creaking of the doors, everything enveloped me like a carefully staged scene. But inside me, the feeling grew that this inheritance was not a gift, but a trap whose workings I still did not understand. At the end of the visit, we sat on the porch, from where we could see the undulating horizon of coffee fields under the shy morning sun. The wind brought the intense, almost too sweet aroma of coffee flowers, and I closed my eyes for an instant. When I opened them, I met Jeannie's fixed gaze, cold, calculated, silent. She didn't need to say anything for me to understand. Whatever had started at that retirement home was only now unfolding, and I, even without wanting to, was already caught in the web she had spun. On the way back to London, inside the silent limousine, I couldn't help but notice how Jeannie was on the phone the whole time, giving quick orders, citing the names of lawyers and deadlines. It was as if my presence were just a detail. I looked out the window and saw the coffee fields being left behind, that green sea that now, officially, belonged to me. But the word belong sounded strange, almost absurd, as if it were a temporary loan. The cold leather of the seat pressed against my back, and a question hammered away. What did she really want from me? That night, back at the retirement home, I was greeted by a different silence. The residents stared at me with hungry, curious eyes, as if I were now a faded celebrity. Mrs. Henderson couldn't contain herself and commented, "So, you're a plantation owner now, eh?" Who would have thought? The tone wasn't one of celebration, but of poison. I felt a chill run down my spine. The news had spread too quickly, like fire in dry straw, and I knew that, from then on, nothing would be the same within those peeling walls. The smell of reheated soup still permeated the corridor, but I couldn't eat dinner. I went straight to my room and sat on the narrow bed, the locket clenched in the palm of my hand. I thought of my husband, already deceased, and how he would react to all this. Would he see it as a blessing, or as a dangerous bait? The memories of our conversations in the kitchen, smelling of fresh coffee and crumpets toasting in the oven, seemed so distant. Now, what I had was the shadow of a sister who returned not to share affection, but to throw me into a silent battle. The next morning, an unusual commotion took over the retirement home. A man in a suit, carrying a leather folder, came in asking for me. He was a solicitor, sent by Jeannie to formalize the transfer of the plantation and the money. "Mrs. Sullivan, we just need your signature here," he said, opening the documents on the dining room table. The smell of fresh ink on the paper seemed to mix with the smell of burnt beans coming from the kitchen. My hand trembled as I held the pen. I felt that, by signing, I would not only be receiving, but also handing myself over to something I still didn't understand. "Don't be afraid, ma'am. This is for your own good," said the solicitor, with a rehearsed smile that didn't reach his eyes. There was something about him that bothered me, an excess of confidence, like someone who had done this many times before. I took a deep breath, felt a metallic taste in my mouth, and asked, "What if I don't want to sign?" He looked at me for an instant, surprised, and then replied, "It would be foolish to refuse an opportunity like this." The words came out soft, but they carried the hardness of a veiled threat. I ended up signing, but the knot in my stomach only tightened. The other residents peeked, from a distance, like witnesses to a show they weren't invited to. The sound of rain began to beat on the roof again, and each drop seemed to mark the rhythm of my surrender. I left the room feeling lightheaded, as if I had left a part of me on that paper. The plantation and the millions were now officially mine, but the feeling was one of loss, not gain. That same afternoon, I received the first call on the retirement home's phone. It was a male voice, hoarse, that didn't introduce itself. "So, old Mrs. Sullivan is the plantation owner now? Get ready because you won't keep it all alone." The dry sound of the line going dead left my hands icy. No one there had my number. No one called me. How did that voice know? A shiver ran through my body, and I realized that Jeannie's gift was also a sentence. I still didn't know who I should protect myself from. The strangers who were now roaming my life, or the sister herself who, under the mask of generosity, seemed to have placed me at the center of a game of forces bigger than I could imagine. The call that afternoon didn't leave my head. I spent the entire night tossing and turning on the narrow bed, listening to the creaking of the mattress and the intermittent dripping of the pipe in the wall. The smell of mold seemed stronger, as if it had become embedded in my lungs, and with every breath, I felt a tightness in my chest. I slept little, and when sleep finally came, it was interrupted by confused dreams of people knocking on my door, demanding something I couldn't deliver. At dawn, Sister Beatrice entered the room with an afflicted expression. Mrs. Sullivan, there are 2 men waiting for you at the gate. They said they need to talk to you urgently. My heart raced. The air grew denser and my hands turned cold. I got up slowly, trying not to show the weakness I felt, and followed the nun down the narrow corridor, where the smell of cheap disinfectant mixed with burnt porridge became nauseating. Upon reaching the entrance of the retirement home, I saw 2 men standing in the morning heat. One of them wore a battered hat and worn leather boots. The other, younger, chewed gum noisily. Both had sun-beaten faces, which betrayed a life in the countryside. The older one stared at me firmly and said without ceremony, "You should know that plantation doesn't belong to you alone. There are old scores that need to be settled." The voice was dry, like gravel. The silence was heavy. I felt cold sweat run down the back of my neck, and I squeezed the locket in the pocket of my dress, as if it could protect me. "I don't understand what you want from me," I managed to say, my voice failing. The younger one laughed, a short and mocking laugh, and replied, "We want what's ours. Jeannie knows what I'm talking about, and if she didn't tell you, maybe she doesn't want you to know." That went through me like a dagger. What else was my sister hiding? The nurses watched from a distance, restless, but none came. Closer. I felt my legs trembling, as if the cement floor under my feet would give way at any moment. The older man took a step forward, the strong smell of tobacco impregnating the air, and added, "Think carefully. Mrs. Sullivan, money and land attract snakes. If you don't share, someone will take it by force." The echo of the threat vibrated inside me, louder than the noise of the birds on the power line. Before I could answer, the 2 of them walked away slowly, leaving only the dust from the road and the feeling that they had marked their territory. I stood there, with my breathing short and my stomach in knots. The sisters whispered to each other. Some residents peeked through the windows, and I knew everyone was commenting. The retirement home, which had always been a silent haven of monotony, was now turning into a stage for something I never imagined facing. Real threats, from people who spoke of debts I didn't even know about. I returned to my room with short steps, each one echoing in the narrow corridors. I sat on the bed, the smell of old iron coming from the rusty window, and let the tears fall. But they weren't just tears of fear. There was also a muffled revolt against Jeannie. If there were secrets in that fortune, why was she making me a target? Why was she using me as a shield for a story she hadn't told me completely? The locket burned in my hands, and I almost opened it, as if inside I could find an answer that didn't come from her. That afternoon, Jenny appeared at the retirement home again, as if nothing had happened. She was immaculate, smelling of expensive perfume and wearing a navy blue suit. But I no longer looked at her with the same eyes. "They came looking for me," I said, even before greeting her. Her gaze hardened for an instant, almost imperceptible, before she regained her artificial calm. "Don't worry about them, Dawn. They're just ghosts from the past. I'll take care of it." But her voice sounded false, and at that moment I realized that the worst was yet to come. After Jenny left my room that afternoon, I remained in silence, looking at the peeling walls as if searching for answers in old moisture stains. The smell of mothballs from the old cupboards mixed with the expensive perfume she left in the air, and this mixture turned my stomach. I knew that those words, ghosts from the past, hid something bigger, but she wouldn't tell me. For the first time in a long time, I realized I was truly alone, with no one I could fully trust. The rest of the day was one of restlessness. The residents approached with disguised curiosity, asking things like, "So, Mrs. Sullivan, have you decided what you're going to do with so much money?" Some cackled, others whispered behind my back. Every look seemed to carry a silent judgment, as if I had done something wrong just by receiving an inheritance. Walking down the narrow corridor of the retirement home, with its constant smell of thin soup and cheap soap, became a torment. I was no longer invisible. Now, I was a target. At night before dinner, I was called to the phone again. The voice was the same, hoarse and firm, without a greeting. "Do you think you can hide behind her? That plantation has a history, and a lot of people died for it to be yours. Be careful, because what she didn't tell you could be costly." The call was short, but every word went through me like a blade. I stood there in front of the phone, the sound of the dining room in the background, cutlery clinking, muffled voices, contrasting with the emptiness that opened up inside me. When I returned to the room, I found an envelope on the bed. There was no sender. Inside, only an old, yellowed photograph. Jeannie Young, arm in arm with a man I didn't know, in front of the same plantation house we had visited. On the back of the photo, written by hand, just 3 words: "She hasn't changed." The smell of old paper and faded ink brought a deep nausea. Who had left that in my, room? How had they gotten in without anyone noticing? I spent long minutes staring at the photo, my hands trembling. The memories mixed with that unknown face, and for the first time, I feared not only Jeannie's secrets, but my own safety. I went to the narrow window, breathed in the cold night air, impregnated with the smell of distant rain, and realized I needed courage. If I didn't discover what was hidden behind this inheritance, I would end up being just a disposable piece in a dangerous game. The next morning, I decided to confront her directly. When Jeannie arrived in her impeccable routine, I entered the room where she was talking to the solicitor without ceremony. The smell of freshly brewed strong coffee dominated the room, but the metallic taste in my mouth prevented me from enjoying it. "I want the truth. Jeannie, who are those men? And why are they saying that plantation has blood on it?" My voice came out trembling but firm. The solicitor tried to interrupt, but she raised her hand, asking for silence. Jeannie's gaze hardened. For the first time, there was no smile, no millionaire's pose. She took a deep breath, adjusted her pearl necklace, and said, "Dawn, there are things you wouldn't understand. What matters is that now everything is in your name. But if you start asking questions, you'll regret it." The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of rain on the zinc roof. Her words were not just a warning, they were a clear threat. I left the room with wobbly legs, feeling the cold of the icy floor under my feet and my heart beating wildly. The smell of damp wood in the corridors seemed to follow me, mixed with her perfume that insisted on staying. I understood that, from that moment on, I had to choose. Either I accepted the inheritance in silence, pretending not to see the secrets it carried, or I started looking for the answers, even if it cost me the little piece I had. And deep down, I already knew what my choice would be. That night, I could barely close my eyes. The retirement home seemed more silent than ever, but it wasn't the usual silence of routine. It was a silence that carried expectation, as if the very walls were attentive. The buzzing of an insect near the fluorescent lamp broke the quiet, along with my racing heart. I held the photograph in my lap, observing every detail. Young, Jeannie's smile, the man beside her, the plantation in the background, the smell of aged paper stuck to my fingers, reminding me that it wasn't my imagination. When I finally fell asleep, I was awakened by a strange sound coming from the corridor. Footsteps. Slow, almost shuffling. The floorboards creaked in a way I didn't recognize. I held my locket and held my breath, waiting. A shadow passed by the crack in the door, but it didn't knock or say anything. After a few seconds, the footsteps moved away until they disappeared. My heart was still pounding in my chest when I felt cold sweat running down my forehead. The smell of mold seemed stronger, almost suffocating. In the morning, I found Sister Beatrice in the dining room, preparing the usual weak tea. "Was someone walking in the corridor last night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She frowned and replied, "No, my dear. The doors are locked, and only I have the key." The firmness of her answer didn't convince me. I knew what I had heard. I tasted the bitter taste of burnt tea in my mouth and swallowed along with it the certainty that someone was prowling, watching my every move. A few hours later, another envelope was waiting for me on the bedside table. This time, it contained only a phrase written in large, crooked letters: "What is given can be taken away." There was no photograph, just the strong smell of fresh ink that soaked the paper. My fingers were stained with blue when I touched the letters, and I felt panic rising like an internal fire. Who was getting in there? How was no one seeing anything? With each new message, I was more certain that they were trying to drive me mad. I went to the sister's office and demanded answers. My voice came out firmer than I expected. Who is getting into my room? Who is leaving these papers? The sisters exchanged glances, confused, and one of them, Sister Teresa, said, "Maybe it's someone from inside the house. Mrs. Sullivan, strange people are always moving around here." Those words, said carelessly, chilled my blood. I wasn't even safe inside. The smell of burnt candle wax, coming from the oratory, mixed with my anguish. That afternoon, I decided to be brave and went to quaint Jeannie's office at the main house. The environment was sophisticated, shelves full of hardback books, a yellow-lit lamp illuminating the mahogany desk. The smell of leather from the armchairs mixed with the aroma of tobacco, which I noticed came from a recently extinguished cigar in the ashtray. "Someone is threatening me, Jenny. They're getting into my room. What have you been hiding from me?" My voice echoed through the room like an accusation that could no longer be swallowed. She sighed, got up from the chair, and went to the window, from where she could see the immensity of the coffee fields. "Dawn, the life I built wasn't clean. I did what I needed to do to get here. And now, you're part of it." My whole body went cold. The words fell like an impossible weight to carry. It was the confession I feared. The fortune was not just the result of work. The silence that followed was so dense that I could hear the creaking of the old house's wood, as if even it were reacting to the exposed secret. "And why put everything in my name?" I asked, my throat dry, feeling the metallic taste of blood on my lips from biting them so much. She turned slowly, her gaze hard, with no room for tenderness. "Because I can no longer carry it alone. And because, if something happens to me, they'll look to you for the answers." The words echoed in the stuffy room, mixed with the smell of cold tea that came from the distant kitchen. It was at that instant that I understood. I hadn't received an inheritance. I had inherited a burden. I left Jeannie's office with trembling legs, as if I had just received a sentence. The heat of the British afternoon immediately enveloped me, bringing the sweet and almost cloying smell of coffee flowers mixed with the dust raised by the wind. I walked along the porch of the big house trying to breathe deeply, but each step seemed to sink me further into a shifting ground. I no longer had any doubts. My sister had dragged me into the center of something I never imagined living at 78 years old. When I returned to the retirement home that night, I noticed that the atmosphere had changed. The residents were not just whispering about me. Now they looked at me like someone observing a dangerous animal, with distance and mistrust. Mrs. Henderson, the most talkative, said loudly for everyone to hear, "Be careful, everyone. A big inheritance always brings death with it." The phrase resonated in the stuffy hall, mixed with the smell of watered-down soup bubbling in the pot. I swallowed hard and went up to my room, feeling the weight of the stairs stuck to my back. Upon entering the room, I found the window open, despite clearly remembering closing it before I left. The cold night wind stirred the thin curtain, bringing the smell of damp earth and wet leaves. On the bed, another note, written in crooked letters, just one phrase, "She will fall, and you with her." The paper was damp, as if it had been wet by the recent rain, and my hands trembled as I touched it. I felt my heart race, and for a moment I thought of screaming, but fear silenced me. I decided to look for Sister Beatrice immediately. I ran through the dimly lit corridors, hearing the creak of the wooden floor and feeling the sweat running down my back despite the cold of the night. I found her in the sister's small office, surrounded by religious books and the smell of burning candle wax. "They're getting into my room again. They're going to get me," I said, almost breathless. She tried to calm me down, but the fear on her face said more than words. Suddenly, we heard a louder crack, like breaking wood. The residents began to get agitated, some crying, others praying aloud. The smell of burnt candle wax from the oratory spread, mixed with the collective panic that was taking over the retirement home. Minutes later, the men's voices echoed in the courtyard. "She's in there! Open that door!" I screamed silently, without making a sound, but feeling my throat burn. Cold sweat ran down the back of my neck, and my legs could barely hold me up. I didn't know if the worst was coming from outside or inside. The retirement home, which had always been a decadent shelter, was now a stage for war, and I, in the center, was defenseless. Suddenly, a car stopped in front of the gate. The headlights illuminated the scene, and I immediately recognized the silhouette of Najum's Janiashi's getting out of the limousine. She walked firmly, as if she were in control of everything, despite the chaos. "Get out of here now! This woman is under my protection!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the air. The silence that followed was suffocating, only broken by the sound of heavy breathing and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The men hesitated, exchanged glances, and backed away slowly, not without casting one last threat. "This isn't over." The phrase echoed in the damp air, leaving a scar on the silence of the early morning. Jeannie entered the retirement home without asking permission, bringing with her the strong smell of perfume and the wet street. The residents looked at her as if she were both a savior and guilty. I, huddled in a corner, felt my whole body trembling, but not from relief, from revolt. When she approached, she spoke in a low but firm tone. "Now you understand why I did what I did. Without me, they would have already finished you off." I wanted to reply, wanted to scream that it was she who had put me in this crossfire, but the words wouldn't come out. Only the bitter feeling that my life, which before was reduced to being forgotten, was now trapped in a snare made of money, silence, and blood. And even while trembling, something inside me was starting to change. I wouldn't accept being used like this forever. After that night of terror, I couldn't go back to being the same. I spent hours sitting in the armchair in my room at the retirement home, watching the window in silence, my eyes burning with fatigue. The morning sun entered shyly, illuminating the dust suspended in the air, and I wondered how many more times I would have to endure that dirty game. The smell of weak tea from the dining room didn't give me an appetite. My mouth still had the metallic taste of tension. I knew I had to make a decision, and fast. Ginny returned in the afternoon, as if nothing had happened. She came in immaculate, with the same haughty posture, ignoring the suspicious looks of the residents and the whispers that ran through the corridors. She brought a folder of documents and threw them on the dining room table. "Here are the contracts. With them, you can sell everything. Dawn, if you want, but it has to be now." Her voice was firm, and the sickly sweet perfume seemed to invade every corner of the stuffy room. I looked at those papers and felt a shiver. It was as if she were trying to get rid of something, pushing the weight onto my back. "Sell it?" I asked, my voice hoarse with disbelief. "After all this, you just want me to sign and give away what's left of our family?" She kept her gaze fixed on me, without blinking. "What's left of our family died a long time ago. Dawn. Now there's only survival." The impact of those words left me breathless. I felt cold sweat on my back and my throat was dry. It was confirmation that the bond of sisterhood that once existed between us had been broken forever. The nurses watched from a distance, not daring to intervene. The residents whispered, and the sound of cutlery clinking against plates in the dining room created an uncomfortable background, as if the entire institution was witnessing our ruin. I took a deep breath, ran my hand over the papers, and felt the smooth texture under my wrinkled fingers. For a moment, I thought of giving in, of signing and ending it, but the locket in my pocket seemed to pulse, reminding me that I still had choices. I got up slowly, feeling my bones crack, and looked Jenny in the eyes. I spent my whole life sewing for others, without ever having anything of my own. Now you want me to be your shield, your alibi, your victim, but I won't be. The silence that followed was dense, broken only by the buzzing of an old lamp above us. Jeannie's hand trembled for an instant, imperceptible to others, but visible to me. She didn't expect me to stand up to her. "Harsh Dawn, you don't understand what you're getting yourself into," she said, now in a lower, almost whispered tone, but loaded with threat. I took a step forward, feeling my heart pound, and replied, "I understand more than you think. And if I have to fall, I'll fall on my feet, not hidden behind you." My own courage surprised me. It was as if decades of silence and submission had exploded all at once. I took the documents from the table, folded them calmly, and handed them back to her. "You can carry your secrets alone. I won't be your shield." The words came out firm, each syllable marked like a stitch. The entire dining room seemed to hold its breath. Jenny stared at me, and for the first time I saw something like fear in her eyes. It wasn't fear of me, but of what my refusal could unleash. I turned my back and walked to my room, my steps slow but firm, hearing the dry sound of my shoes against the worn floor. The familiar smell of mold enveloped me when I closed the door behind me, but for the first time, it didn't seem suffocating. On the contrary, it was the smell of home, of a space that was still mine, even if it was small and forgotten. I sat on the bed, squeezed the locket against my chest, and felt a strange serenity. I had finally made a choice, and that choice would change everything. That night, the entire retirement home seemed to be in suspense. The residents whispered in the corridor, and even the nurses walked faster, as if they feared something would explode at any moment. I stayed in my room without dinner, just holding the locket in my hands. The cold metal reminded me of who I was before all this, of the girl from the Lake District who dreamed of sowing her own destiny. And I realized that the only way to get out of this game alive was to finally take the reins of my own story. I spent the early morning hours writing on scraps of paper I found on the bedside table. My hands trembled, but the writing came out firm. A letter. In it, I detailed everything that had happened since Jeannie's arrival, the men who threatened me, the notes left in my room, the gate invasion. I also wrote about her confession, about the plantation and the money placed in my name as a shield. Each word was a stitch, firm and irremovable. The smell of the pen's ink mixed with the mold of the room, and together they formed the atmosphere of my final act. When the day dawned, I placed the letter inside the locket, carefully folded. No photograph was worth more than my own truth. I closed the small silver object and held it tightly. If something happened to me, someone would one day open that locket and find my voice. And this time, it wouldn't be muffled by the silence of a lifetime. I took a deep breath, and the cold morning air entered as if it were cleaning my lungs of the accumulated dust of years of resignation. Jeannie Muntaud appeared at the retirement home shortly after breakfast, wearing a beige suit and smiling as if she owned the world. The residents shrank into their corners, watching her with frightened and curious eyes. I faced her head-on, without looking away. "I need to talk to you, Dawn," she said, already leading me outside. The smell of her expensive perfume enveloped me, but this time it didn't nauseate me. It only reinforced the contrast between the two of us. In the garden, under the still shy sun, she tried again. "Sign the contracts. Get rid of this. I guarantee it will be better for you." The voice was firm, but now there was a hint of urgency that hadn't been there before. I looked around, the sound of the sparrows filling the air, and realized it was the perfect setting for the outcome of a lifetime of submission. I took a deep breath and said, "No, Jeannie, I won't sign. And if I have to, I'll tell everything I know." For an instant, her face lost its mask. I saw anger emerge in her eyes, her jaw clenched, her fingers squeezing the folder she was carrying. "You don't know what you're talking about, Dawn. They won't spare you." The threat sounded more like desperation than power, and it was there that I realized she no longer controlled anything. I, on the other hand, had the choice. The locket weighed in my pocket as proof of my decision. "Maybe they won't spare me," I replied, my voice calm, almost serene. "But at least I'll fall telling the truth. And you, Jenny, will fall with me." The silence that followed was so dense that even the sparrows' singing seemed to cease. The wind brought the sweet smell of coffee from a distance, as if the earth itself was waiting for the next stitch in this final tapestry. She didn't answer. She just stared at me, as if she wanted to pierce my skin with her eyes. Then she turned her back and got into the car, slamming the door shut. The limousine's engine roared loudly, raising dust, and in seconds, she disappeared down the road. I stayed in the garden, feeling the sun slowly warm my wrinkled skin. For the first time, I wasn't. Trembling. I knew the battle wasn't over, but inside me, something had already changed forever. I was no longer anyone's shield. Aftergunned, Jeannie's. Limousine disappeared down the road. I slowly walked back inside the retirement home. The narrow corridor seemed more silent than ever. Only the echo of my footsteps broke the emptiness. The smell of cheap disinfectant still permeated the walls, but this time it didn't bother me. I felt as if I was walking through a space that no longer defined me, as if that place were just the setting for the end of a stage in my life. I was no longer just the forgotten elderly woman in the back room. In the dining room, the residents watched me in silence, and even Mrs. Henderson, always ready to make a bitter joke, held back. I walked to the table, poured myself some of the watery tea, and stared at the steaming cup for a few seconds before drinking. The taste was the same as always, bitter, watered down, but inside me it no longer had the same weight. It was as if even the tea recognized me as a different person, someone who had finally chosen to speak. I spent the afternoon writing a second letter, longer, with calmness. I recounted everything again, but this time in detail, including names, dates, and every episode of threat. I wrote about das Janais, about the men who came to the gate, about the notes and the veiled confession she had made to me. I placed the letter inside a brown envelope and asked Sister Beatrice to keep it in the home's safe. It's to be delivered to the police if something happens to me, I explained. She looked at me in silence, her eyes moist, and just nodded. The weight I felt upon handing over the envelope was paradoxically liberating. It was as if I had finally embroidered my last dress, stitching into it not only cotton threads, but also the truths that had always been hidden. The smell of fresh paper and glue still stuck to my hands when I returned to the room. I sat on the bed and, for a few minutes, just stared at the locket. Now, it no longer held old memories. It held a future that depended on the courage I had found. The next day, I received another anonymous call. The voice was the same, hoarse, but now it seemed less threatening, more curious. "So you're not going to sign anything? Are you ready for what's coming?" I took a deep breath and replied for the first time, "I am, and I'm not alone." The silence on the other side of the line was long before the call dropped. My hand trembled as I hung up, but not from fear, but from the adrenaline of realizing that I was no longer running. I was facing. Little by little, I noticed that my posture was starting to change even in front of the residents. They no longer whispered as much, and some even came to talk to me. "Mrs. Sullivan, you look different, stronger," one of them commented, almost whispering. I smiled slightly and replied, "Sometimes, we only discover our own strength when there's no other way out." The smell of hot porridge filled the air, but for the first time I didn't feel nauseous. I just felt that the time for me to hide was over. Later, in the retirement home garden, I sat down to watch the sunset. The London sky was tinged with orange, and the fresh air brought the aroma of wet earth from the past rains. I squeezed the locket in my pocket and felt the metallic firmness against my fingers. It was the constant reminder that my story was no longer hidden. It was written, preserved, and, if necessary, revealed. And that awareness gave me a serenity I hadn't felt in decades. At night, before sleeping, I looked out the room's window and saw the city outside, illuminated by yellow streetlights. The shadows still prowled, I knew that, but inside me there was no more terror. There was only the certainty that I had stopped being a passive shield. I was now the seamstress of my own decision, and the stitches I had made would not be undone. I lay down, breathed in the familiar smell of mold, and, closed my eyes with the strange, yet firm, feeling of relief. The next morning brought an unusual silence. There were no residents' whispers, nor hurried footsteps of the nurses in the corridors. Only the distant crowing of a rooster and the smell of warm bread in the dining room. I got up slowly, put on my simplest dress, and fixed my hair in a simple bun in front of the cracked mirror in the room. The reflection I saw was no longer that of the forgotten old woman. There was firmness in my eyes, even with the wrinkles that betrayed the years. Upon going out to the garden, I found Sister Beatrice waiting for me. She was discreetly holding the brown envelope I had given her. "It's safe, but if you want me to hand it over now, I will," she said, looking around cautiously. I touched her arm and replied, "Not yet, but I want you to know that I trust you more than anyone else here." The smell of freshly cut grass filled the air, bringing a sense of freshness that contrasted with the weight of the matter. In the middle of the morning, a car stopped again in front of the retirement home. This time, it wasn't Jeannie's guy limousine, but a more modest vehicle, still elegant. A man in a dark suit, with neatly combed gray hair, got out and introduced himself as an independent solicitor. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've heard that there are documents in your name and that you've been under pressure. I've come to offer help." His voice was calm, but his eyes analyzed every detail around me. The discreet scent of lavender seemed to try to soften the hardness of his words. I invited him in, although my hands were sweating with distrust. We sat in the small lounge, where the smell of waxed wood mixed with the aroma of brewed coffee. He opened a folder and showed that he was already aware of the plantation, the transfer of assets, and even the threats. "You need to understand, this is not just a family gift. It's a living file, full of old disputes. If you don't act, you'll be swallowed." I felt my heart race, but I kept my gaze firm. For the first time, I spoke aloud something that had been maturing inside me. "I want to sell it, but not to hide. I want to sell it and use that money my way, for something that gives me peace. And before that, I want what they did to me to be recorded." The phrase came out trembling, but true. The solicitor watched me in silence for a few seconds, and finally, nodded slowly. "If that's your decision, I can make sure everything is done safely." After he left, I returned to my room and sat on the bed, taking a deep breath. The smell of mold seemed less aggressive, almost familiar, as if to say that this was the end of a cycle. I took the locket from my pocket, opened it carefully, and touched the folded paper I had placed inside. I didn't cry. I just closed my eyes and thought that in some way I was sewing my last dress, not for others, but for myself. In the late afternoon, when the sun was already setting and tinging the sky with orange, Jeannie had appeared by surprise once more. But this time, she didn't find me fragile. I was sitting in the garden, surrounded by the residents who, curiously, had come to listen to me. "Dawn, we need to solve this. You can't face what's coming alone," she said, with impatience in her voice. I just smiled slightly and replied, "I've already solved it. Jeannie, my part is not to be a shield. It's to be the owner of my own ending." The silence that followed was profound, only. The singing of a wren in the distance broke the scene. The residents, who used to just whisper, now looked at me with respect. And Jeannie, for the first time, didn't know what to say. Her lips trembled, her eyes darted away, and she simply walked away, going to the car without looking back. I stayed there, taking a deep breath of the wet earth and the English twilight, knowing that I had chosen my path, and there was no turning back. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The silence of the retirement home was broken only by the distant croaking of frogs and the isolated crowing of a rooster. I put on my cleanest dress, tied my hair in a simple bun, and held the locket against my chest. I knew that would be the day I would change my destiny definitively. The smell of watery tea came from the dining room, but I didn't stop. Something stronger was calling me. I went to Sister Beatrice's office and asked her to accompany me. I handed her the brown envelope and said, "It's all here. I want it to be officially filed today at the police station." Her look was filled with both astonishment and pride. "Are you sure, my dear? This could have serious consequences." I took a deep breath, feeling the cold morning air fill my lungs, and replied, "The consequences of keeping silent would be worse." A few hours later, we were in the city center. The smell of fried pastry from the market stalls mixed with the smell of petrol from the buses passing by. I carried the locket in my pocket, as if it were an invisible weapon. We entered the police station, where the sound of typewriters and the creaking of chairs formed the soundtrack of bureaucracy and justice. I handed the envelope to the officer and said in a firm voice, "I want to file a report, not just about the inheritance, but about the threats, the secrets, and what my sister did to me." The officer, a man with a thick mustache and a grave voice, quickly read a few pages and gave me a serious look. "Are you aware that this could turn into a legal case and affect a lot of powerful people?" I nodded without hesitation. "I am aware. I spent my life hiding, and I don't want to die as a shadow." The smell of fresh ink on the paper seemed to seal my decision. I was no longer the seamstress for the rich brides of the Lake District. I was the seamstress of my own truth. When we returned to the retirement home, the news had already spread. The residents, who used to look at me with disdain or envy, now looked at me with a mixture of respect and fear. Mrs. Henderson, always sharp, just commented, "That woman is still going to bring down some big people." I smiled slightly, not out of vanity, but because I felt that, for the first time, my voice was echoing beyond the moldy walls. The smell of beans on the stove once again seemed comforting.